So, namaste. Pleasure to be here. I'll share the screen then with the PowerPoint that I have. That's it, I guess. And we go to there. Okay, can you see the screen? I don't know if anybody's able to respond to me. These one-way modern presentations now online. Anyway, so the thought for this Foundation Day was to look at that which was the early work with Swamiji and which seems to have paralleled into my own particular life, hence this going from what's in the texts to what's on the medical side and in the body. First off, full great congratulations to Kaivalyadhma. Already 96 years since the physical location, and we know that Swamiji was doing his work and research many years before that. So really we're looking at a century already when Madhava Das would have inspired Kaivalyadhma ji to look more into what these practices actually do, explore them, understand them. And of course, that's been an inspiration to me. And learning that through Kaivalyadhma ji's student, my teacher, Shri Tiwari. So I've had the fortune to be many times in Kaivalyadhama, study, research, practice there, etc. Learn. So it's an honor to be part of that history, even though it's only a little bit out of 96 years. So congratulations anyway. So just in case people don't know, philology from the academic sense is definitely the work on researching textual material. And you know, Swami Kuvalayananda made it part of his mission early on to collect as many texts, original texts on yoga. And there are still many out there. And there's a couple of other groups today that are doing good work on it as well. So that philology, critical editions, studying of text, gives us a better idea of how these practices came to be, how they impacted on life, how they disseminate teachings, etc. And then philology to physiology. Of course, it's not just limited to physiology, but that's more of a general way to get into describing impact from a healthcare, medical point of view, well-being, lifestyle factor, and with a definite effect when you look at what these practices do, of what goes on a physiological aspect. You know, on screen here, of course, is a original manuscript, the copy of the first issue of Yoga Mimamsa, which you could say was a first attempt, almost 100 years ago, to bring these worlds of the original texts, and as you can see there, a actual scientific study done then on Nauli. And not too much later, to the side of this slide, there's an excerpt from an article that was written up in Time magazine. So that's in 1937, because one of the medical students at Yale University, actually focusing in the psychiatry department, Dr. Behanan, went over for a year's study with Swamiji, and then put out a book on this. So clearly, even by the 30s, we had this marriage of philology to physiology and getting out there. And still, it's an effort putting it out there almost 100 years later. Little story for us just to get into. Somewhere in the mid-1800s, you know, so we're going back only 150 years, 170 years, I guess, at this point. The well-renowned Swami Dayananda Saraswati, the story goes anyway that he took a corpse, and cut it open to find out where all these things that they talk about in the texts are, chakras, etc. And upon not finding them, was quite repulsed, quite put off, felt the texts were useless. What are these practices about? And threw both the body and the texts away. Now, of course, it might be a bit apocryphal, bit of an exaggeration, but still the story does highlight a good point. And I often think that if Swami Kuvalayananda was there when he was doing that, he might have said, not so fast, slow down. You forgot the scientific method. And it's not just a cut open look or read a book and expect that it's verbatim truth. We need to explore, we need to look into these things more, and we need to put them under experimental method. And that was the key. So, great figures like Swami Vivekananda were describing, you could say, modern scientific aspects of the 1890s with yoga, prana, etc. But it was more theoretical. It was based on actually his point of view. The same with a book that came out years later. One of the first studies that Kaivalyadhma did, trying to look deeper, you could say a bit beyond Dayananda, was to employ the X-ray and look for the Kundalini. Of course, he couldn't find it. And that, you could say that quest, that story goes on today. But back then in 1927, a book was published on the mysterious Kundalini and relating it to the right vagus nerve. But again, it was pure conjecture. It had good information in terms of physiology, and it had reasonably good information in terms of a so-called chakra system. But it was then somebody's idea, in that case Dr. Rayla's, to marry the two. And both the foreword by Sir John Woodruff and even a article commenting on it by Swamiji later considered it inaccurate and really just somebody's point of view. So to get at it, there is detail in texts. There is progress on a biological, physiological, scientific level, and how we put them together, hence this philology to physiology. So again, this opening statement from Swamiji 96 years ago, and it's a statement that has pretty much inspired me to get involved in this area. And let's just read it anyway. The coordination of the Western, and then when you say Western, the Western and Eastern today is a little bit outdated, but we could look at modern scientific methods, call that Western. Now it's all over the world. Thought, call that the ancient original teachings that are at least a few hundred to a few thousand years old. So the coordination of the Western and Eastern thought, and hopes by their assimilation to work out a philosophy which will perhaps give satisfaction to the greater part of humanity. And in that there's wisdom in both, and neither of them are completely accurate, but by exploring and experimenting and studying both, that we actually progress, we go further. It's like both see from two different sides, so how can we progress with that? And the understanding of it as a fullness for a human life. So as he continues to write, as the function of a well-developed yogin is to harmonize the various forces working for the good of ill of the human race, and if possible to evolve order out of chaos, it shall be a part of his duties to make a careful study of politics, sociology, and economics in general. So when we look at this, it's not just biology, physiology, what's in a statistical study on the petri dish, etc., nor what's just written in an old text, but it's what is relevant to society, to people, how we live. And this did, I suppose, continue to inspire me into my own studies in what is more or less a field of biocultural anthropology. If you go back to 1924, sociology and anthropology were actually considered the same field. But of course, there's a whole biological aspect, and that is studying human beings engaged, my sense here in yoga, practice across cultures, understanding context in terms of spirituality, therapy, and society. So, in other words, the study of a molecule in a petri dish tells you one specific detail. Study human beings in different contexts. Yoga is highly relevant because you've got people, now yoga being globalized, you've got people in highly different living situations, relationships to practice, different economic situations, different environmental stressors. And so all of these aspects, of course, have to be considered. And it's a huge part, if we're going to look at it therapeutically, the previous experiences, the current environment they live in, and the state of the country that one might be in, our current unique circumstances, which are felt generally globally, but you go to different countries and of course people are experiencing in different ways. And on one sense, there's a broad category of yoga and yoga practice, and then another level, it's how it works for different people in different settings, at different times, and at different levels. So with that, it's, I think, important to understand this paradigm for yoga in practice, right? Yoga in action, yoga practice in action, really. So how it continues across generations and over centuries. Now we understand the original text, the Philology. There's an oral tradition, and that ideally is carried from the teacher, and it's carried with understanding. And both of these, of course, impact the practice of the student. And what we have there is a nice, neat 3 intersecting circles with a perfect middle section. But obviously, the situation is never really like that. And without research, we'll tend to slip into what is a situation that is quite common today for many involved in yoga, where you can lose the original understanding, the original meaning of what yoga is about and the nature of practice. And instead you get into a lot of anecdotal material. So instead of it being a well-versed, well-learned oral tradition, it becomes a little more self-styled. Everybody knows a little bit of yoga text because everybody can quote Yoga's Chitta Vritti Nirodha and say that such and such a pose is in Hatha Pradipika, etc. But for the most part, the richness of the early writings, teachings, how they've evolved, how they've come together is unknown. And as I've said, there's a few groups. Kaivalyadhama was an early group harnessing especially Hatha yogic texts to understand, and then some other groups over in London and so on have carried that on today. And I think it's a fantastic work, but how do you get it so that it keeps that an oral tradition as opposed to self-styled, and the student practices more than just different takes, different stylized takes on asana, where there can be an unclear practice that it doesn't relate back to what is the original purpose. So really just to sort of highlight or harness my point that research is needed, and research is sort of the central thread to bring all these aspects together. We need to test hypothetical statements. Some of those are in the texts, some of those would come directly from the oral tradition, and some of them are perhaps what you might call clinically observed, that which is being experienced in practice. So for myself, for the study that we did last year in Kaivalyadhama, and it will be based on elements that are grounded in the texts. It'll use practices that come from the oral tradition, detailed in the text. And at the same time, there's a little bit of clinical observation. Myself working with thousands of people over the year, start to see where particular tensions build up. And then is there a way to look into that more? Innovation is a part and parcel of the yoga history. And it's part and part of human history, really. And it's not that yoga teaching stopped at 15th century in such and such a text. Really, since then, there's been huge innovation, and you can see it from the 17th, 18th century to today, so the last max 300 years, a lot of innovation, but primarily in the field of asana. The classic practices of shatkarmas, breath practices, have more or less remained in their form, but that's also because they haven't been popularized or commercialized. Whereas the asana did make contact with other cultures, other forms of working the body. And you have to allow for these innovations. And it's easy to get carried away with a powerful voice leader speaking on such innovations, but at the same time, they need to be put to the research test. Well, are they really doing what you claim they're doing? And in what setting, and for who, what kind of people? So what's essential from there then is to develop protocols. And right now we're kind of dependent on either dogmatic systems, everybody do that and do the same, or the whim of a instructor, come teacher. From a therapeutic point of view, it can only proceed if protocols are in place. So if there's a psychotherapist, psychologist working in their office, and they want to incorporate the breath to help and aid their patients, then unless they're extremely well practiced and trained in it, which would take many, many years, a couple of decades really, then they'll be sort of thrown out half-learned methods, hoping that it might fit with their work. Whereas if there's protocols that have been tested, show some validity, and they can be brought into such treatments and therapies and practices. And currently, even after 100 years, we're pretty short on that. And it might be the politics of the yoga world, the popularity of it, etc. It's also hard to progress this in a heavily scientific world. So within that, of course, you can reveal markers of progress. And that would be, they could be biological markers, they could be psychophysiological. I think one of the best ways of looking at it, especially from a spiritual point of view, is how the EEG plays out. But we have a lot going on with studies we do on around the heart, certain blood markers. And then, of course, there's many well-developed psychology tests. Again, they're kind of just specific pointers. They're markers because, there are individuals in this, there are outliers, which comes back to the anthropological context of taking and involving the human being. So we can understand the physiology better. You could say the textbooks in a few decades may not have changed because most of the study and work was done on it. Maybe recent findings on interstitial space and lymphatic aspects up in the brain are about the main additions. But really, there's something that goes on, those of us that practice deeply yoga practices, and we know that there's a little bit more to this, and a little bit more that goes on physiologically. Of course, there are erroneous approaches. Some of those are actually in texts. If I get time, I can show. And some are in the oral tradition. And of course, that was definitely an interest of Swamijis up to 100 years ago to look at, well, who is saying what and why, and does that make sense? somebody claims some great feat, when really there's like somebody burying themselves in the pit that he liked to test on, and you could find, oh, well, really they're letting oxygen in. So today, of course, there are great statements made about yoga practice. It seems like it can cure everything. And we need to understand the setting and how often, how frequent, how much, and who's capable of it. That it doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't work in the same way for everybody. So these are the things to understand. And then, of course, we can apply it in healthcare, and ideally then in the marketplace. I personally am a healthy person, yet I value yoga practice and the daily, and I mean daily, use and engagement in it, which is me applying it to keep me healthy. And then I'm thankful for having learned routines and practices and so on, but it's taken time. And when I go out there teaching, people are at a loss to know exactly what to work with and how to keep it up, etc., even though we do our best. So the research can, of course, amplify that. And if it can bring it more into healthcare and into the marketplace, then all these millions and millions of people that engage in practice in yoga around the world can engage in practice in something that now has maybe corrected aspects, has looked at protocols or identified markers that point to health or progress, well-being. And for many of us, it's a spiritual journey. And even in that, there are markers to identify. And that's huge on the last point there, aiding the psychology, how we manage ourselves. And especially under the current global pandemic time, the focus on mental health is huge, and it's going to go up. And if you ask me, the nature of yoga practices and the greater field of yoga practices, especially when it comes to how the breath works, how to self-assess, mental attitude, those aspects of yoga practice, so moving on from just the asana approach, are huge to impacting this. But to get it out there is the challenge, you could say. And part of that challenge is that there's a gap between the texts in modern physiology in terms of concept of body, disease, modern living, diet. And that's where, again, research comes in. So the words that are, of course, used in these texts are prana, nadis, chakras, vayu. If you're well versed in reading these texts and studying this material, then you know more or less what they mean, or do you? There are attempts to match it directly, meaning, a nerve is a nadi, but is it? And what exactly is a chakra? And where is this so-called energy that moves, Kundalini? How do you measure energy? We're back to the physiological side. So, or perhaps that this pranic system is predominantly subtle, that impacts the gross, but it exists in its own subtle realm that really hasn't, other than what's in the text, hasn't been identified or assessed yet on the scientific side. So on the scientific side, as you can see the modern picture on the right, it's more of a very, very accurate description and detail of the physical body, which is leaps and bounds ahead of what, of course, you're going to find in some of these old Sanskrit texts because of the progress in technology, science, and study in the last 150 to 200 years. However, the statements in these texts on prana, nadis, chakras are still valid. The question is, how are they valid? How do they relate to this modern physiology, modern anatomy? The texts, of course, speak of a particular diet, but if I told the majority of students today to just have milk and ghee for the next few months while you start your practice, it wouldn't come through. Nor is it the same milk that was recommended back in those texts based on how milk is produced today. And of course, modern living, we're living in predominantly urban, maybe suburban, congested, polluted areas, very different to a isolated hut with a teacher close by. So we have to be able to translate, and that's what I see, the philology to physiology, being able to translate what is valid structure, be it subtle or not, with an impact on the gross way of practicing, translate that to our modern context. And again, you can go off what I say, what others say, or we can put it more deeply into research. Further on this, do we practice in isolation or in combination? Swamiji in the Yogic Therapy spoke about an integrated approach to treating the human as a whole, okay, which is something I definitely believe in. And from a practitioner fullness of practice, you tend to go for the in combination. But the tricky part there is, like if I started talking about the value of vitamins, you might eventually start to ask me, well, you know, which vitamin? And don't they do different things? And don't they have different effects? And the lack of some is more serious than the lack of others. So there's the fundamental research on a general yoga practice in context, and then specific research on the, again, would be specific identified effects of particular practices. For example, you know, the correct nature of Kapalabhati and its impact on, you could say, respiratory function, or particularly on heart rate variability, or even on mental brainwaves. So Swamiji also pointed out that it's more than just exercises and you know, nice plush body therapies of lavages, massages, etc. It's more than that, way more. And again, the research can come into this big time on autonomic reconditioning and immune system enhancement is a lot of what the at least this physical to physiological side of the yoga practice gets down to. The danger is how we interpret it out of these texts, okay? We definitely need now the language of modern anatomy, physiology, biology, neuroscience, etc. It does require social understanding, cultural context. And then, of course, as I've highlighted, develop the protocols. Now, because I see I've got 2.5 minutes left, I'll quickly run through. There are sort of some great statements in the text, but they, you know, they're mainly valid for the practitioner and the experienced practitioner. An experienced practitioner can make errors, and then you're given like, and I've applied these without having to resort to sort of medical help, etc., is to apply the nature and the focus of the breath on particular areas and to remove an issue in the body. But a text most people may not know, but Kaivalyadhama did publish it in 1970, the Satkarma Sangraha, and it's one of the few yogic texts that tries to combine the medical side, Ayurveda, language and techniques with yogic techniques. Again, because of lack of time, I won't go through those, but you know, when you summarize what's at least in the Hatha Pradipika, it talks about, if you can read those, you can see it's a particular almost type of issue, disease, which may not fully relate to us today, okay? I mean, who knows of dropsy today, but it's edema. And one of the causes of it is malnutrition. So maybe practicing alone, not eating enough, or having issues. Or, as the case might have been a few hundred years ago, living close with animals. Other zoonotic infections, etc. So, what still isn't clear, and again, you can't just rely on the word of one teacher, so you'd need to develop it down in a protocol. So how many of each practice, how often, which precautions, which prerequisites to take? Did that just come anecdotally, or is it something we've worked out more? Very advanced practice, Mahamudra, it seems to do great things, but being experienced in it myself, it would take years of development and then very skillful practice to do it. See? So, some of these texts over there, the Yogic Upanishad, will talk of particular approach, numbers, etc. But again, it's beyond the realm that many can do. As I'm reaching my time, I did want you to see that because this is an error in one of the texts, if you ask me, and it is well presented in this Siddhasiddhanta Padati, but when you read it, the description of fetal development and birth defects, it's completely wrong. And we know that because science has advanced. So then you have to ask yourself, well, what are we basing it on, both from the text? How can we put that into a greater form of study? And let's bring this philology to physiology together. And I want to thank Kaivalyadhama, and wish a great foundation weekend and continued talks.